bad reputation. So even though it's balanced, because it has a bad reputation, we put it in a book of busted variations, even though it's not busted. Even though there's equalizing variations, we say it's absolutely unsound. Now there's a blogger out there who doesn't like the Philidor Gambit. He keeps calling it junk. But then when you look at his analysis, there's at least one variation in which his assessment is that the position is plus over equal slash equal. In other words, black is like that close to equalizing, and if that's junk, then there's thousands of chess openings that are junk, because when you're black, pretty much at the end of the first 12 or 15 moves, you're going to wind up slightly worse because white gets the advantage of the first tempo. So there's a big discrepancy between the rhetoric and the analysis. And I remember in October 1994, when my first edition came out, I got a phone call from my publisher, Bobby Dudley, in Pennsylvania. There were only 1,000 copies printed. He goes, "Jim, I got some good news. You'll be happy to hear this. The German book dealer just bought 80 copies of your book." I said, Bobby, that's great, but I don't understand something. If he bought 80 copies, the German book dealer, he expects to sell them, but nobody plays this opening. And he said, "Jim, I run into this problem all the time. I publish books on a lot of other rough beat openings. It's chess snobbery." That's the way he described it. In other words, they'll buy the book, they'll read it, they'll add it to their collection of chess books, but they won't play it because they think it's beneath their dignity. Snobs, the problem that snobs have is something that they don't like. Instead of just saying, "I don't like it," they say it's bad. So they'll go to the art museum and they'll see an abstract oil painting and say, "Abstract oil painting is an art, it's junk," because they don't like abstract oil painting. Or rap isn't music. How can they give out a Grammy Award for rap? I heard one guy say indignantly, rap is junk. Well, obviously the guy doesn't like rap. It doesn't mean that it's not music just because he doesn't like it. Or as a literature major, I remember people talking about modern poetry, which doesn't rhyme and it doesn't have any metrical pattern. And they'll say this free verse, that's not poetry, And the Philidor Gambit does not follow Steinus' general principles. But that doesn't mean it's not chess. And I've literally had chess masters say to me, "How can you play that? That isn't chess."
Oh, shit.
That isn't chess, and that's an unbelievably snobbish comment. And obviously it is chess. What they mean is they don't like this style of chess play. And because they don't like it, now they're going to say that it's junk, that it's busted, that it's absolutely unsound, even though their own analysis, you don't even have to go to a secondary source, contradicts, the rhetoric that they use. So this opening, the problem is one of reputation. And I think Paul Morphy, if I had to break down that chess snobbery that Bobby Dudley was referring to in the phone conversation, I think it's 1 part anti-pawn snobbery and 2 part anti-Morphy snobbery. Because a lot of people, even though back in the 1700s, this new idea was dawning on the political thinkers that the common man, we the people, are more important than the aristocrats, there's a lot of chess players who would disagree with that. They still think that the pawns are third-class citizens. You'll read comments, "Too many pawn moves in the opening." Brent Larson, in his book, Why Not the Philidor, he condemns this variation, saying that the move F5 for black contributes nothing to black's development, which is totally the opposite of Philidor's philosophy. Philidor felt that the only true development in the opening is to move your pawns. Now, I have a mind of my own. Just because I'm telling you Philidor's philosophy doesn't mean I agree 100% with it, because what I found out in the 22 and a half years and the more than 800 games that I played this opening, there's good news about Philidor's philosophy and there's bad news. The good news is that Philidor is absolutely right, that all your chess pieces become very active, very powerful. You're never going to have a bad piece locked in by your own pawns if you play the Philidor countergame. There's no question about that. But the bad news, and it took me about 1.5 years to figure this out, at the end of 1.5 years, I actually had a -4 score with the Philidor countergame. Now I have a plus 240-something score with it because I finally figured out the right way to play it. When you push those pawns forward, the bad news is you're burning your bridges behind you. There's no turning back. The best guardians of weak squares in your position are your pawns. And pawns can't move backwards. So once you play the Philidor counter gambit, you know, you got to keep playing actively with those pieces. It's kind of like what Frank Marshall said about his martial attack on the Roy Lopez, that he subscribes to Joe Louis, the boxer's philosophy that a good offense is the best defense. So forget about trying to consolidate your position. In 1796, a year after Philidor's death, they had the thematic chess match in London. It was a 5-game match, and Black lost all 5 games, so I don't know how much of a tribute it turned out to be. Obviously, the guy that volunteered to play the black side of this opening, he never played it in his life before and didn't know how to play it properly. His mistake was that he didn't realize you can't consolidate your position. Once you push those pawns forward, he was just, his name was Wilson. It was Atwood versus Wilson, and Atwood won all 5 games. And Howard Staunton, in the 1800s, being from London himself, was familiar with that match, and he actually annotated the match. So when Paul Morphy goes to London in 1858, all roads lead to London in this story here, he played against Howard Staunton. Staunton dodged Morphy in the one-on-one match, but they did have 2 consultation games. Morphy and Barnes versus Staunton Owen, and then Staunton and Owen versus Morphy and Barnes. And in the one game as Black, which I'll argue was the most important game as Black that Morphy ever played in his life, he played the Philidor counter gambit against Howard Staunton. He played right into Staunton's analysis. Staunton's analysis ended with the evaluation that White wins, and Morphy busted the variation right over the board in 34 moves. He crushed it. Morphy's evaluation of that same position that Staunton had said White wins was that Black's sacrifice of the rook. The reason why Staunton thought White wins is that the queen moves 5 times to capture this rook over here. So you're up, and you're up in exchange in a pawn, and in one variation it would have been exchanged in 2 pawns, but your queen spent 5 tempos. It's going to take another 2 tempos to get your queen back to safety. Morphy's evaluation was that the sacrifice of the rook is well worth the confinement of White's queen. Morphy, Fred Reinfeldt once said about Paul Morphy, he was born 100 years ahead of his time. Macon Chabot, in his book, Paul Morphy, The Evolution of Chess Theory, says that Paul Morphy, and the first time I read it, I said, that must be a typo. I better reread this sentence. He said, Paul Morphy was the first positional player. Paul Morphy was a tactician. What do you mean he's the first positional player? But then Chabot gives actual examples of all of these brilliant tactical combinations that Morphy played, and you realize that there was a positional foundation for all of these tactics. You know, these tactics didn't spring from nowhere. Morphy understood, for example, in that consultation game, that if the queen's over here on a horrible square, there's a game where he beat Thomas Barnes in the Philidor counter gambit where Barnes's knight wound up over here, that's a big positional advantage for the player of the black pieces. You don't count material. You don't say, well, I'm down in exchange. What you say is I'm ahead in tempos. The 4 compensations that I found out that black gets for a small material sacrifice. That's why it's called the counter game. You're going to be giving him a small amount of material as black. You're going to get the better pawn center as black. And usually in a double E-pawn opening, White gets the better pawn center. How many times have we seen this diagram in a chess book? This is a typical pawn formation in dozens of E-pawn, double E-pawn openings. White has the advantage in the center. But in the Philidor counter gambit, what's going to happen is in a few moves, let's say in this variation, for example, which happened in a couple of Morphy's games, black has the better center. All right? Just like that, it's like role reversal. Now you're going to wind up losing this rook over here. You're going to lose an exchange, and you get this pawn for it. So you'll be down a theoretical pawn, but one of the 4 compensations you're going to have is that instead of White having the better pawn center in the double E-pawn opening, black has the better pawn center. So right there, you might be getting your pawn's worth of compensation right there. In addition to that, you can have a lead in tempos. Usually White has a lead in tempos in any opening. And because of that 1 extra tempo, White wins 55% of the time and black only wins 45%. Yet, for example, in this game against Thomas Barnes, incredibly, this is one of the most amazing games you'll ever see, where Morphy sacrifices everything but the kitchen sink here as black. Barnes is going to wind up winning this knight 9 times. 9 times. And at the end of the game, Morphy will have sacrificed this knight, 2 bishops, 2 rooks, and his queen. The only piece that he doesn't sacrifice is the king knight, and he wins in 24 moves. And you say to yourself, how can you work that kind of magic? Well, when a guy spends 9 tempos moving the same piece around like a beginner, and Thomas Barnes was a strong player. He beat Morphy more than any other chess player. He had 8 victories against Morphy. And that's probably why Morphy asked him to be his consultation partner in those 2 games against Thornton and Owen. And yet, he had to resign after 24 moves. So black gets the extra tempos in the Philidor counter game, not white. So again, it's like a role reversal. The third advantage you get is better piece coordination. You know, at the end of the opening, you'll be down a small amount of material, but white's pieces are in disarray. The queen might be over here, the knight be over there. His pieces don't coordinate as well as black's. Black's pieces harmonize better. Now, it's a very esoteric, it's very difficult to quantify, to put a numerical value on piece coordination, but it's there. If you look at the games in the Philidor county game, black's pieces just cooperate better than white's pieces. And the final compensation that you get is you get a powerful counterattack. Now, it's a near-death experience. Gary Kasparov calls white's attack in the Philidor county game nearly decisive. But the key word is nearly. Nearly decisive means it's not decisive, but you have to play very accurately. And when Bobby Fischer named Paul Morphy to #1 on his top 10 list, that was the adjective he used to describe Morphy. Probably the most accurate player of all time. You know, not the strongest player, not the greatest player, not the most talented player, but he was accurate. And you have to play this opening. You know, this isn't Larry Evans, what's the best move? But there's the best move, the losing move, and the okay move, which is neither winning or losing. There's only 2 possibilities when you're playing black here. Either you play the right move or you lose. I mean, that's the one downside risk to this opening. There's no safety net. You know, there's no margin of error. It's kind of like the matador in the bull ring, where if the matador makes 1 false move, he's dead. But if he doesn't make any false moves, the bull's dead. You know, so that's what it really boils down to. You have to make no false moves in this opening. And the best way to play it is the way Morphy played it. Now, Wilson lost all 5 games and never sacrificed anything, and Atwood came crashing through in all those weak squares. In one game, he actually sacrificed his queen and came crashing through. And Wilson just couldn't defend all the weak squares. Morphy, in all 5 games that he played, and he had 3 wins and 2 draws, 2 of those games were so well played that they wound up in a book called 40 Morphy Masterpieces, which tells you the high quality level of the games that Morphy played in this opening. But in all 5 games, Morphy sacrificed material. And sometimes you say to yourself, why? You know, and it took me a year and a half to figure out why. Because I was -4 after 18 months, and I sat down and looked at those games and I said, you know what I'm doing wrong? I'm getting a good opening, and my own Steinitzian training is killing me. I'm trying to consolidate. And it suddenly dawned on me, that's what Wilson was trying to do in those 5 games that he lost. You can't consolidate your position when you have too many weak squares because you pushed all your pawns forward. And then I finally figured out that's why Morphy sacked material in all 5 games. He knew, he understood that when you play this opening, you don't count material, you count tempos. You know, and there's some chess players that I've spoken to in the last 22 and a half years and have said, Jim, I can never play that opening. Whenever I'm down material, I get nervous. I can't relax until I get my material back. Well, you can't play the Philidor game. If that's your temperament, this is a fighting. Chess is a war game. You know, chess is a war game, and the Philidor counter gambit. It's like a barroom brawl, you know, or maybe a street fight. It's, you know, one tactical shot after another. It's not Steinitzian chess, and you know, and you can't really fault Philidor for that because when Philidor died, Steinitz hadn't even been born yet. Steinitz wasn't born until more than 40 years later, so it's not Philidor's fault that he, you know, didn't follow Steinitz's general principles. Now let's just take a look at, there's 4 key variations in the Philidor counter gambit, and we're not going to have time to go into much depth. But just let me show you this one game that Morphy won with it. Now you can see already that Barnes is going to win an exchange.